Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, especially for those who are joining us from Asia, including our two speakers. I'm Nicolas Veron. It's my pleasure to introduce this new session of the Financial Statement Series at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And today we will indeed discuss finance in Asia and especially financial centers. With a little bit of a Tokyo, Japan-centric perspective, but also a broader debate about the region. So I'm very grateful to Saiko Nakagawa, or Nakagawa Saiko, if it's more properly said in Japanese, for joining us today, and to Sumit Agarwal from Tokyo and Singapore, respectively. Nakagawa Saiko-san studied initially at Keio University in Tokyo, where she got a bachelor's degree in economics in 2000. She then joined the Japanese Financial Services Agency, where she has worked ever since, with a few interruptions. She got a master's of Pacific International Affairs and International Economics at the University of California in San Diego. That was in 2004. She was a staff economist at the Japanese Cabinet Office in the mid-2000s, and also a visiting fellow at Stanford University in the early 2010s. At the FSA, the Japanese Financial Services Authority, Mrs. Nakagawa has led numerous projects. I will mention two. One is that she managed the G20 team for the FSA during the Japanese presidency of the G20 in 2019. And the other one, which is more daunting, is that she chaired the CPTPPs. I always forget the acronyms, the Comprehensive and something Trans-Pacific Partnership, as the committee of the CPTPP negotiations on financial services in 2021. She's now the director for the asset management business at the FSA, which is part of the Supervision Bureau or Directorate General of the Financial Services Authority. Sumit Agarwal studied at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he initially was in computer science and got a master's of economics and a PhD in economics in 1999. He then worked a little bit for the private sector at Bank of America in the early 2000s, then in the Fed system at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago until 2012, when he joined the National University of Singapore. Sumit has occupied too many positions at the National University of Singapore that I can mention them all. He also did a stint at Georgetown University here in Washington in 2016-2018. At NUS in Singapore, he's a professor of finance and also professor of real estate at the School of Business, a professor of economics at the School of Arts and Social Science. He holds a Lo Tek Kwang Distinguished Professorship, and he's also the head of the Department of Real Estate, but that doesn't summarize it because Sumit has numerous involvements in Singapore public life. He's also been a consultant for the Bank of Uganda, the World Bank, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, of course, also the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. And he's the author of several books, including several on household finance, but also several editions of a book called Kiasunomics, and I learned that Kiasu is a very important Singaporean concept that maybe we will come back to in the course of the discussion. With that, Saiko, over to you.
Thank you, Nicolas, for kind introduction and for having me here. Can you put the slide? Yes. Great. So today's topic is about the Asian Financial Center. But before jumping into the theme directory, let me start with some macroeconomic background. Turn to the next page, please. Okay. So first, Japan. You may remember the trade wars from the 1980s and have an impression that Japan's large current account surplus was created by goods trade, but in reality, it is now supported by primary income, which is the net flow of profit, interest, and dividends from investment in other countries. The trade surplus started to shrink in the 2000s and even turned into a deficit between 2012 and 2015, while net income continued to grow. So while Japan earns its current account surplus through its investment, their investment management is unfortunately not so good. The right-hand three graphs shows the growth of household financial assets in the US, UK, and Japan. The line chart shows the amount of outstanding financial assets in each country, indexed to 1 at the year 2000 level. The bar chart shows the contribution from the investment returns. The financial assets of Japanese individuals are said to amount to 2,000 trillion yen or 14 trillion in US dollars. More than half of this is held in bank deposit. These cash holdings provide meager returns. As a result, while household financial assets have tripled in the US and increased 2.3 times in the UK over the past 20 years, in Japan, they have increased only 1.4 times. Prime Minister Kishida pointed this out in his speech at the Guildhall in London in May this year. He said, "This is a waste, but also a source of future potential." Now let's look at the situation in Asia. Next slide, please. While Japan has a lot of money looking for better investment, its neighboring countries have a strong demand for funds. The World Bank recently published a report about the economic update for East Asia and the Pacific region. According to the report, the Chinese economic activity is expected to slow down in 2022, and for the first time since 1990, the rest of the region will grow stronger than China. Also, there exists a huge financial gap to achieve the SDG goals in the region. The region is estimated to need $1.5 trillion investment annually to achieve the goal by 2030. And this projection translates into about 4% of the region's GDP. Next slide, please.
And of course, SDGs is a Sustainable Development Goals, right?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. Another factor which may have an impact on the cross-border funds flow is the growing tension between the US and China for technological superiority and security concerns. Chinese FDI in the US information and communication technology sector hit a peak in 2016, then almost disappeared. If you look at the flip side, the US FDI in the Chinese ICT sector also continued declining. And there seems to be some impact in the area of portfolio investment as well, as a number of Chinese firms, such as PetroChina and Sinopec, have announced. They have notified the New York Stock Exchange that they will apply for the voluntary delisting. And I believe the China-US audit issue was the theme of this webinar a couple of weeks ago. And it may not end up being just a concern between the two countries. Some media have reported that growing security concerns and warning from the US, making Israel high-tech startups reconsider whether to accept financial backing from China. Next slide, please. Here are some hypotheses which are mutually interrelated, and they may be wrong, maybe right, but I hope they could offer a good starting point for today's discussion. So first, resiliency over efficiency. For a long time, the primary focus in business has been on efficiency. Well, having a single financial hub in one time zone is the most efficient form of financial service production. But after we went through the global pandemic and experienced a situation in which people can't easily visit even neighboring countries for some years, we may now think that, well, that's not the most resilient way in terms of maintaining business operations and the threat of not only the pandemic, but also other risks such as cyber attack, natural disaster, and political instability. Well, some people started to mention that manufacturers now need to shift from a just-in-time system to just-in-case system for their supply chain management. Well, this might be applicable in the financial sector as well. Well, second, beyond the economic rationale, a number of political events happened in the past few years, which have had an influence on the global financial landscape, from Brexit to Hong Kong's civil unrest and to the war in Ukraine. Well, political risks are nothing new, but people or businesses may overlook them in usual times and pay more attention to if the business is generating earnings in the near terms. But today, with all these happening, it might bring renewed attention to the importance of political stability or respect for the universal values such as the rule of law. And third, the geopolitical perspective. This might be the most controversial one. So let me emphasize again that this is just one hypothesis and of very my personal one. And I also wanted to stress that as a financial regulator, I'm rather on the side of having deep concerns about fragmented financial market. Okay. Then having said that, I would like to put this on the agenda of my presentation. Well, will the world need a marketplace that matches its growing funding needs with non-China money? Hong Kong has raised its profile as a financial center by taking advantage of its role as a gateway to the Chinese economy for the rest of the world. Or is Japan or Singapore expected to play such a gateway function to the rest of the region? And they offer good access to capital for the region without the fear of doing balancing act between the two superpowers. So putting all this together, the answer to the fundamental question of who will be the financial hub in Asia during these uncertain times could be Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, or all of them. We don't know. Maybe the important thing is that we just work for it and do our best, then let the market decide. So now let me turn to what the Japanese government has done to become a financial center. Yes, in this slide. While there exists a lot of potential and opportunities in Japan, given its huge financial assets and relatively large size of stock market, there are also disadvantages and barriers to entry in such areas as language, taxation, visa, and residential status issues. So we are fully aware that just tweaking financial regulation, the area over which the FSA has jurisdiction, is not enough. That's why we come up with a government-wide collaborative approaches. I'm not going to go into the details of this table, given the short time left for me, but let me briefly explain. Well, first, in order to address the issue of the language, the Financial Market Entry Office was created in January 2021. It serves as a one-stop contact point for newly entering asset management firms from overseas, and it provides with business or legal consultation. It accepts financial licensing application and conducts daily regulatory interaction, all in English. And the taxation is a very challenging area for Japan. Japan is not a city-state and has a fair size of rural areas, so government needs a certain amount of revenue. So, but we have made some reforms in the areas of income tax, corporate tax, and inheritance tax. For residential status issues, which falls under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Justice, and foreign financial professionals can now obtain the preferential status easily and enjoy the accompanying benefits now. Last but not least, we also provide some financial incentives to the new entrants by reimbursing the setup cost up to 20 million yen, 140,000 US dollars per company. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the Japanese government, the International Finance Center Initiative, started in 2020 under the strong leadership of the former Prime Minister Suga, and it continues to be a top priority under the Kishida administration. And next slide, please. So this is a list of the financial firms which started the business in Japan using our Financial Market Entry Office, which I just mentioned. The type of licensing they received varies from investment management business, investment advice and agency business, to type 1 or type 2 financial instrument businesses. Some are large asset managers, and the others are global hedge funds, private equity funds, and the leading market maker like Citadel Securities. Also, you see some firms appear twice, meaning that they first enter into the Japanese market by acquiring an IAA license, advisory license, which is relatively easy to get, then decided to expand their business here. I believe this is a welcoming move. We are approached by many more prospective new entrants at our office, and as our border reopen, I expect this growing trend to last for a while. So wish us a good luck. And the last page, it just shows our website, which contains a lot of information about our initiatives. So if you are interested in, please visit it after this seminar. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saiko. Sumit.
Yes. So let me start out by thinking what makes a city or a country a good financial center. So I think there are a few ingredients you need. You need the rule of law. You need investors to believe and capital markets to believe that that's where they can set up shop. And a lot of that means that they believe that they can bring their families and live there and enjoy the quality of life. Now, if I think about Asia, how many cities can I name where investors, the rule of law, the pollution, the environment are factors that will attract people to come? I will rule out many cities in India. I will rule out most of China, Indonesia, Malaysia. What is left is pretty much Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore. Now, we have been seeing these three cities trying to kind of duke it out over the last 30, 40 years to be the financial center. And they have all had some space, and they have managed to kind of work along with each other. And they have kind of learned to share that space of financial center for Asia. Japan used to be the dominant financial center, and then slowly with taxation and other perks, Singapore and Hong Kong had edged in. But now if I think about the current state of the world, China has been trying to kill Hong Kong as a financial center. Now, Seiko will not say this. I mean, I can say this. I'm an academic, so I'm free to speak my mind. That, look, we don't need to worry about Hong Kong anymore. It's not that Hong Kong is not a viable option. In my state of the world, Hong Kong is a viable option. But the Chinese government has been trying to destroy that as a financial center. Either they don't like it or they want to build a comparable financial center within the mainland China. So who are we left with? We are left with Tokyo and we are left with Singapore. Now, I don't think we will settle this today or we'll ever settle this. I think both of them are fairly viable financial center. All we have done, because of the riots in Hong Kong and the dispute between Hong Kong and China and COVID, is eliminated one player as a financial center. Now we may have alternative players grow up in the future. I can imagine Sydney, which also has the similar kind of background and provides all the things that I would like a financial center to have. Maybe in 10 to 15 years, I could imagine Mumbai to become one of the big financial centers, because India is opening up, it's going to attract a lot of capital. And actually it has the rule of law, it has big population, it has democracy, and it has not the same problems that we experienced in China during COVID, or we are still experiencing those problems with China during COVID or past COVID. So I think those are the kind of things I would think where we will be going or thinking about a viable financial center. Now, why I think Singapore will still be an important, or maybe trying to compete with Tokyo and maybe even overtaking Tokyo in the future, is because of the fundamentals or the economics of it, which is very low taxation, which is attracting all these financial companies, and the geopolitical location of Singapore. It has a very stable political system, whereas Japan still goes through frequent transitions in government that causes some hiccups for financial institutions and their ability to think about what could happen in the future, how also the currency, the yen, has been moving around, and the inability of Japan to essentially come out of what has been a lingering depression or a long-term suppression of economic growth. So hence, I think Singapore will do better in Asia, I would see, in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, clearly, I am biased. I mean, I live in Singapore. I'm invested in the economy. I've seen what the government is doing. It's still a small player. The only advantage it has, or the biggest advantage it has, is the location. Now, if you want to capture markets in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, or even if you're investing in those countries, it's the best location for a financial manager. And the language helps a lot for people to be in this location. I'll stop here and I will let Nicholas to decide and kind of take the conversation forward.
That was super, both of you. Thank you so much. I didn't really intend this to be a Tokyo versus Singapore match, but still the lineup makes it a little bit inevitable. So thanks for having set the scene that way. One question, one maybe immediate question, maybe to you, Sumit. You didn't mention Seoul at all, but Seoul is sizable. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I have thought about Seoul as it is a regional financial center, but I have never thought of Seoul as a center that is kind of important for Asia. I mean, whenever I think of Asia, I think Seoul got passed over by Hong Kong and Singapore very quickly. I think part of that has been language, the rule of law, the location. It's too close to Japan, too close to Hong Kong, and it kind of got lost in that process. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I just don't see it trying to compete with Tokyo anytime soon. So Tokyo will still have the dominance position just because of the size, because of the trust and the rule of law. And obviously, I mean, people like to live in Tokyo. I mean, when you are attracting people who get paid $1 million a year, they want to live with their families and cities that they say, or they have the bragging right to say, I live here.
So another question that is high on my mind is, of course, we're talking about competition in Asia, and I think the regional dimension, if only because of the time zone, is paramount here. But there's also a global context, right? And boundaries are being redrawn. I'm thinking particularly of Brexit. Dramatic things are happening in the UK these days. So maybe Sumit first and then Saiko, is Brexit changing the equation at all, or whatever is happening in Europe and the UK, or is that completely outside of the picture? Sumit.
It's not. I think you're spot on. So there is a movement away from Britain, and part of that movement is going towards New York, but part of it is also moving to Asia. And when you think about Asia, the right place or the obvious place used to be Hong Kong, but now everybody says, oh, why would I go to Hong Kong? Let me move to Singapore. Let me give you an example. Singapore has created new family offices from China. In the order of 1,500 new family offices have started within the last 2 years in Singapore. All these family offices would have typically gone to Hong Kong, but they came to Singapore because of what happened in Hong Kong. And these family offices are the people who will attract financial institutions and investment community to come to Singapore.
Saiko on this and everything Sumit has said.
Well, speaking about the impact of the Brexit, I don't see any direct impact to the Japan's status as a international center. But I think after Brexit, I really feel, as a member of the government, the Japanese government, I feel the Britain is trying to make new connection with the third countries that other than European countries, EU. They wanted to make more collaboration, between London and Tokyo things, and that's going to affect somehow, well, maybe the medium term, but the financial landscape in the global.
I mean, that's a question that is more focused on the UK than on Asia, but I'm still curious. Do you see those efforts that you're referring to making a difference? Because from my perspective, before Brexit, it wasn't like London was not courting the Asian business. There were those relationships, and actually a lot of the pitch for London was precisely its connectivity with Asia through very long-standing links. So
Right.
is there a chance that this connectivity will be increased by the current efforts of the UK government, or is it more likely to be decreased because of the general, difficulty that has affected London in recent years? I'm agnostic on this, but I'm very curious about your opinion.
That's a good question. I haven't really think about it deeply, but it's just my personal opinion. It feels sense that they're trying to have deeper relationship with Asia after the Brexit, and maybe to have that's gonna benefit them, the global balance between the country among the countries, and that's gonna go for them. But I don't know.
So
that's my
this?
best guess. Okay, I have a question about.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Nicholas, you mentioned about Seoul earlier, right? And I'm not really that much familiar with Seoul. And what's the strength of Seoul in comparison with Tokyo, especially? Do they speak more like English, if English is more available there, or you have any idea on that? And I have one question for Summit, but I will leave that later.
Go ahead. Let's bundle them.
Okay, no, that's totally different. Well, Summit, you mentioned that the people is moving from Hong Kong to Singapore, the finance people. And is that, well, I think I remember I read an article, maybe on Financial Times or something, that that's because so many financial, well, other industries, professionals rushing into Singapore, you have scarce in international schools, housing for expat, and is that very happening? So that's question.
Look, so Nicholas, maybe you should answer first. Nicholas.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so look, I think, look, the scarce resources for these high-end expats was more so in Hong Kong than in Singapore.
Right now,
in Hong Kong, to get into the schooling system was actually impossible for most of these expats who were coming from Europe or America. I don't personally think that is a binding constraint, because I think of a typical expat who is a fund manager is not in that age group where their children are in primary school, and so they are worried about getting their children in the right schooling system. They are more likely to ready to go to college, and they are already thinking, where in America are they going to Princeton or Harvard, than they are going to any primary school in Singapore. Now, I'm not saying they don't have junior managers who are still worried about these kind of things. Fair enough. But prices, real estate prices and schooling problems are less acute in Singapore than Hong Kong. But let me come back to the issue of London. I mean, I think this is a serious issue, that London has lost its glamour, and it is losing its glamour almost every week. I mean, now we have some fiscal policy issues that has caused the pound to depreciate. We have a political leadership that is not sure where they're going, and that will also cause people to leave, or London to be a less viable financial center going forward. I also think the focus, the economic and financial focus of the world, which used to be the US and partly Europe, is going to be moving and shifting towards Asia, whereas India and China and Indonesia are going to be the economic drivers in this part of the world. I hope Japan will be, and I hope Japan should be, one of those key economic drivers. And if that is the case, we will see the financial centers to be in Asia, and the right places. What are those financial centers? Is it Mumbai? Is it Shanghai? Is it Singapore? And is it Tokyo? Ideally, those four should be the financial centers. But are we going to be able to create the financial situation or the economic and viable situation for Shanghai and Mumbai to join that club of Singapore and Tokyo?
I see that in the audience we have a number of very highly qualified participants, so I encourage them to engage and raise questions as well. There's a question raised by Jonathan Malamud in the Q&A box, which is not really a question, but more comment, I think, that the Japanese government has undertaken a number of significant initiatives, particularly since last year, but in terms of taxation and ease of access and entry, basically what he implies is that Singapore still wins. So the question, I don't know if you have scoops for us, Saiko, but if there are next major initiatives of the government of Japan to address that imbalance or perceived imbalance between Singapore and Tokyo. Saiko.
Well, I think I would say that now is the time for implement all the policy measures that we have taken in the last few years. So I don't have any, I can't say any particular, we're going to do this new thing like this, but I think, the one thing that I want to point out is we had this policy package, but we came up with them during the COVID. And now it's finally come to the end. And in the past few years, literally, the expat, there's no, the people traveling internationally. So now is the time for us to, see if these packages are effective or not. And well, I'd like to say that we're going to wait for that. Thank you.
And I have a question about geopolitics from Greg Smith about Japan's relationship with China. Sumit told us about these 1,500 new family offices from China that set up in Singapore just in the last 2 years. So Singapore has this very unique relationship with China, right? Balancing the US and China, all that. With Japan, it's less of a balance and more of an explicit alliance with the US or non-alliance partnership, whatever it's called. So non-treaty alliance. Is that a factor in the competition? How can Tokyo compete with Singapore, not just for international money, but also for Chinese money? Or is that basically something that Tokyo has given up on, given the politics? How do you think about that? Saiko, maybe.
Okay. So whether we,
basically, are you aiming at attracting Chinese money, even so you have a lot of Japanese money to invest also internationally, as you showed us?
Right. So yeah, as you said, first of all, we have plenty of money domestically. So yeah, so and of course we also have a lot of farms as well, and I think that our aim is to be a sort of, I don't know, the crossroad for the cross-border investment, not only inbound investment or outbound investment. You want to have all round, all directions, money coming in and people coming in, and we don't have at this moment no particular aim or in a stance that we want to have more Chinese money, or I don't know, or we're going to put more money to Indian companies, or that's all I can say that.
Sumit, do you think that the Chinese politics will allow this flow of business to continue? I mean, isn't there a risk that Xi Jinping would turn, the screw so that Chinese money is more invested domestically and less through Singapore? How do you see that driver of business coming from China?
I think you're right. I mean, look, the Chinese politicians and politics will try to ensure that there is no capital flight away, especially to Singapore or any other country or Tokyo. The problem is that right now, they are not thinking about capital flight. They are thinking about survival, which means they're thinking about political survival, which trumps everything. Hence, there is capital flight as a result of that. Now, who knows, in 2 years, 5 years, when they can say, oh, look, we are going to create conducive situations for you to keep money here. I mean, one thing they did is we will impose global taxation. So that means that you cannot put your money away in Singapore and it will not be taxed in China. But that also creates people who are wealthy billionaires of China. They are just trying to take citizenships abroad because they realize it's not worth it to be Chinese citizen and live in China and actually be able to work. I mean, I have numerous examples and stories where people in China are saying, look, I just don't want to be here because there's too much uncertainty. Let me come back to one point. I don't think
just on this, Sumit, before you move on, where does it take citizenship right now? Does it take it in Asian countries, European countries, Latin America? What's the pattern?
So I think Canada is a very popular destination. Australia is another popular destination, and also places like Singapore, which is slightly difficult. But when you're a billionaire, things become easier for you in life. Let me come back to this thing. I really don't want to make this issue of Singapore versus Tokyo. Look, these are very different. We are comparing apples to oranges. Singapore is a city-state that has to inherently rely on foreign capital to come in here and can sit in here and look for fund managers or bankers to kind of find home for that money. Tokyo doesn't necessarily have to do that. Japan is a country that has inherently, or for years, for decades, been producing some of the best products in the world. So they actually have domestic wealth that still needs to be invested, and domestic billionaires who needs to place those wealth in funds and grow it. And obviously there are other markets. You can think about, there are players from Europe that want to invest in the Asian market and they inherently trust Tokyo. So I don't think we should think about that, will this be? What I feel is, will Shanghai and Mumbai, they'll be able to take off, or they will be permanently killed because people will realize we don't need them because we have Singapore and Tokyo, and we are happy with that.
Interesting. I have this question from Takeo Hoshi, who is with us today, and talking about fiscal issues. So you mentioned the UK summit, but how do both of you compare Tokyo and Singapore on this point? I suspect that Takeo is hinting at the high level of government debt in Japan, but you may respond any way you like. Maybe Saiko first.
Okay, let me read the questions actually.
So is the fiscal situation, and I guess implied the fiscal sustainability situation of the respective governments, a factor in what we're talking about today, or is that completely outside of the equation? Basically, that's my understanding of the question. But of course, Professor Hoshi may correct me if I understood it wrong.
Well, he was my professor when I was studying at the UC San Diego. But anyway, one of the important protocol that everyone learned when they start working in the government is that never mention about the policies that fall under the other ministries, in the public space. So I'm in a difficult position to speak about fiscal policy of the Japanese government in front of the camera. And I'm trying. Anyway,
you have earned that pass. Sumit?
Okay.
I mean, I think Takeo is correct in his thinking and his point he's making. That look, Japan does have to take care of the internal business on their internal fiscal policy and their fiscal deficit, which is significant. In fact, Singapore doesn't have all those issues, but Singapore has a capacity problem. Singapore cannot grow as much or as big as it would like to. I mean, if you look at the stock market in Singapore, while it is a viable market, but it's mostly illiquid compared to Tokyo or compared to other countries. So I think Singapore has many, many advantages, but still the way I want to think about Singapore has clearly dominated what has happened in terms of Hong Kong versus Singapore. And Singapore will benefit going forward from emerging financial centers. But will Singapore be able to replace Tokyo? I don't know. I don't think so. Tokyo still has huge advantages, despite all the problems that you can envision Tokyo having or have had. I mean, the 40-year fiscal problems, 40-year economic growth problems. But despite that, Tokyo has survived. Imagine if that was the case for Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong couldn't even survive 3 years.
So this leads me to a related question, but which is slightly different and maybe a little bit irreverent, which is about bailouts. We know that in many cases of financial crisis and financial risk concentration, the government has to come in, or at least that's been the observed pattern time and again in major financial centers. And actually, that's what we're seeing also in the UK right now, in a way, even so it's about liquidity provision. So Singapore cannot bail out the market in a major way because it's a relatively small country. Tokyo can in its own remit. Now, is that a curse or a blessing? Because in a way that makes it easier maybe for Singapore to be a level playing field for international institutions and not to have any biased towards national champions. So I'd be very interested in your respective views, maybe asking both, but again, Psycho, if you prefer to decline, that's fine, on this issue, which is basically, can Singapore compete without having the kind of implicit fiscal backstop in case things go wrong that we have seen operating, including, by the way, in Hong Kong in the 80s, if my memory is correct, in a different manner. So maybe Sumit first and Psycho next on that.
Yeah, so I think your question is correct, and I see both plus and minus. The plus is on this side that MAS, which is the Monetary Authority of Singapore, can act very quickly relative to most other central banks. They can take action when they feel there are some problems that could have macro consequences. So they can take action against banks, they can take action against the markets to fix them quickly. The other side is that also from the market realizes there is really no backing by the government. So it prohibits them from engaging in moral hazard. Okay, so I think there is a benefit of not having this backstop that US could have provided or Tokyo can provide to a small country by saying, look, guys, you misbehave, you will go down in flames, and we just cannot support you. And we will, as a country, as a monetary authority, we will take no responsibility and we'll insulate ourselves from you because we'll make sure the institutions within the country are not being impacted by your behavior. So if you actually have excessive risk in the oil sector in Malaysia or Indonesia or any other thing, that's not going to be our problem. So I think there could be benefits for doing that. Let me see, let Seiko say something about what Japan thinks about this.
Well, it's difficult to speak about other ministries matters, but also difficult to talk about our own policy matters. So anyway, it's very difficult to speak for non-academic people to speaking in front of the camera. But well, if I may add something, well, let me say that the mass, Singapore mass, can act quickly. That is the strengths, one of the strengths, and I think Japan can. Well, I'm not trying to compete with Singapore, but I think Japanese FSA can also move quickly, do the decisive action if necessary. And I think that's maybe not the point, but I think if compare with like European Union, they have to make a consensus within the region, but Japan Singapore, we both, can make decisions by ourselves, and that is one of the good things that I mentioned. And maybe I'll stop here. Okay.
On this issue, it's a really interesting issue because we have a comment also by Jonathan Malamud on this issue, and mentioning that MAS is actually very nimble, but Jonathan is referring particularly to the supervisory and regulatory space. So, for example, the regulatory sandbox for fintech innovation, things like that. And actually, I would echo Saiko here. I think for monetary policy and liquidity provision, not only is the Bank of Japan able to make quick decisions, but actually I would even, as a Eurozone European, defend the European framework here. I think the European Central Bank has shown that it was able to make very quick decisions, despite Europe being so complicated, where we have a problem of rigidity and lumbering decision-making processes. I think is more in regulation and supervision than monetary policy and liquidity provision as such. Would you agree with that, Sumit, or do you think I'm giving too much slack to the Bank of Japan and ECB?
I would disagree with you guys, because I think it's just inherent. When you have a city-state and when you have very few number of banks, and when you have a mechanism where you can impose things on them, whereas in Europe, you need agreement from them. In Japan, you need agreement from your banks. Here, the central...
Not for monetary policy. We've seen that. I mean, if you take the beginning of the financial crisis in July, August 2007, for example, the ECB acted even before the Fed did.
That's true. No, I am not even bringing in the US. I mean, US is a totally, it's a turtle. I mean, it's just walking very, very slow. So I'm trying to think about, I remember when there was this whole crisis of cyber and LIBOR. I mean, how long it took UK to respond to LIBOR fixing versus how quickly Singapore responded to cyber fixing issues. It was remarkable. And I could just see how it was a gap of months in terms of how UK responded versus Singapore responded. So I can see, I'm not saying inherently MAS has superior decision-making policy. It's just the nature, because it's a small place. You can make, I mean, I can make faster decisions in my household, but if I have to make faster decisions as a HOD in a business school, it'll be difficult. That's the point I make.
That's very interesting perspective. Thank you for that. I have an additional question on the derivatives markets. You mentioned LIBOR and all that. As usual, I have to declare an interest. I'm an independent non-executive director of the derivative repository arm of DTCC. That having been said, how are the derivatives markets developing in Asia? Where do you see the geography of that particular, as we know, very important market segment? And maybe you can differentiate between different asset classes, because commodities derivatives, rate derivatives, equity derivatives are probably different propositions here. But is it still the case that a lot of Asian corporates and financial institutions are basically managing that in London, or do we see a form of regionalization in that market to a certain extent? I'd be very interested in your perspectives, maybe Saiko and then Sumit.
Well, I think it's partly depends on which currency you're dealing in the derivative. If it's yen, I think that Tokyo has provided great market. They have liquidity, and if it's the pound and it's UK, and well, I never think about the connected derivative markets and the, how that's going to diversify within the region. But I think Singapore, derivative. I don't know. I have nothing to add. Sorry about that.
Sumit?
Maybe Sumit.
So I think, look, derivatives is something which most Asian markets, I think except Japan, has shied away from. in any specific equities or any other market, partly is because of the leveraging requirements and the risk taking, and they don't know how this thing will play out. Whereas, we know how UK and US has been very much encouraging, which I think is the right thing to do. I think it provides liquidity. Economic theory, economic research has found that there is huge value in derivative trading. I think that's a shortcoming in Asian financial centers. I just don't see in the future that we will overcome that. Even if we encourage new financial centers like Shanghai and Mumbai to come about, I just don't see the appetite. A part of it is the regulators are very conservative in their thinking about how to introduce new financial instruments and products. So again, I think in that sense, European markets will still play a big role, even for investment community who are trying to think about how to invest in Asia or how to trade in Asia.
There's a big debate in Europe, as I'm sure you're aware, about the location policy of those derivatives, and the European Union now, after Brexit, is tempted to force a relocation of their share of the market, a little bit like Japan has done with yen activity, as Saiko was reminding us, to force a relocation to the European Union instead of staying in London. Would that affect the dynamics that you're referring to, Sumit? Maybe that question is for you. Do you think that if the EU was going for forced relocation policy, that would make the European derivatives market less liquid and therefore less attractive, changing the regulators' calculation, or would that basically not offset the advantages that policymakers in Asia now see at basically outsourcing all this?
No, so I think the picture will be mixed. I clearly will agree with both of that I do see that there will be a shift away from Europe because of what the EU's position will be. I don't know how much of that will be captured by Asia versus the US or other financial markets who will realize, oh, there is a niche or a gap to be filled. And my personal view will be that New York or US financial markets are going to be taking full advantage of that versus Asia. I think just the issue is the mindset of the regulators in Asia is the bottleneck than
just
anything
a side
else.
question to that is a time zone, does a time zone make it possible? Because there is basically no overlap between the Asian day and the New York day, unlike the situation with London or Europe for that matter. So, but your expectation is that Asian institutions and corporate would make do with that, right? Did I understand you correctly?
I think that's my view. Again, I think this is slightly out of my space, but again, that would be where I would think. But who knows? I mean, again, this is slightly out of my expertise.
Fair enough. Saiko, any comment on this?
For derivatives, no, but can I come back to the previous point that?
Sure.
I think that was Nicholas, you mentioned that if Japan has, or we have any policy about how to deal with Chinese money, whether we are in favor or against or not. And well, I'd rather want to ask a question that, do you think that some people see the value that, just you said that Japan has a close allies with America, the US, or maybe the Western countries. And that's gonna work as a strong point that, that the European American money can be managed in Tokyo without having influence from China. Could that be the value for Japan? What do you think? Sorry for asking question instead of answering question.
I'll turn that question to Sumit. Do you feel, Sumit, that basically Western money is hesitant to go to Singapore because China has influence in Singapore? That's an interesting question.
I'm not sure. I think there is a lot of confusion among people of what Singapore is and where Singapore is. If you ask a lot of people, they don't even know where Singapore is geographically. Okay.
A little red
politically, also, they don't know where Singapore is. I don't think Singapore has any reason to be aligned purely with China. They are a neutral player in Asia, and they want to attract capital, talent, and be a player that can settle issues or be the place that brings in wealth from Indonesia to Malaysia, to Thailand, to China and India, which are big markets in this region. Let me add one more thing to this debate. I think the future, or where we should be thinking about this debate going, or where the financial centers will be, is which financial center will deal with issues of sustainability, ESG, carbon pricing, carbon trading. And there I see Singapore taking a big step forward by saying, look, we are going to be actually having carbon pricing that will go from $10 to $90 or $100 per ton of carbon, and how we will allow carbon trading and how we will think about using our markets, financial markets, to deal with this. I think that will help Singapore quite a lot in the next 10 to 20 years, whereas other markets, this I will even include European and American markets.
Very interesting. And indeed, we have a question from Julia Bingler on exactly that. How will the regulatory drive for climate transition risk resilience affect this question we're debating today, relevance of financial centers, Tokyo, Singapore. Saiko, Japan is also doing thinking about the green transition, right?
Yeah. As you just mentioned, we try to put more emphasis on transitional financing because we have some companies is doing good in the climate, the green in the green standard, but some are not. But we should not leave those companies in heavy industries behind. But we just want to we value their transitional approach. They're trying to make well, right now they may make a lot of pollution, the green gas, but if they can reduce those financial negative for environmental negative impact, then the impact is going to be huge because they given the large share of such industry in the economy. So that is one of the sales point, the characteristic of the Japanese way of promoting sustainable finance. So again, maybe there's no one green financial center, but could be some forms of that, I hope.
Many thanks. We're at the hour. Many thanks to Nakagawa, Saiko, and Sumit Agarwal for what I took as an extremely rich discussion. I learned a lot. I'm very grateful. I hope our audience will follow me in that assessment. We'll have the next session in this series in 2 weeks' time on October 26th, discussing one of the topics that never age in finance, the German so-called institutional protection schemes, arcane arrangements of German saving banks and cooperative banks. So it's much more of a narrow focus, maybe, but important, with Tobias Tröger of the Goethe University Frankfurt. And in the meantime, again, a lot of thanks to our two speakers, also for joining so late from Asia, also many in the audience, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much for attending this session.
Thank you.